Morning, church.
And welcome to 2021. Isn't that weird to hear that we are now in 2021? I mean, I think of when I was young. I remember when I was a child, for whatever reason, I was thinking about the year 2020. I don't know if I just watched some future science movie or what it was, but I remember processing the idea of like, man, can you imagine the future of 2020? And then it hit me as I did the math that I would be 40 when it was 2020. And I remember as a child at the time, that sounded so old, and the thought just weirded me out. It no longer sounds old to me now, right? Like, now, 40, that's the new 20. But it's weird to think that now we're past 2020. But if there's ever been a year that we have more anticipated going into the new year, I don't know what it is. Right? Like every year, I feel like there's some building anticipation about the new year, about new things coming and what the new year has in store for us, and we get excited about it, but I've never seen such longing for the new year as this year. And of course, we know it's for a variety of reasons. We look back at 2020 and we think, man, we are glad to leave that behind. And we know it's this arbitrary line in the sand that we cross, but we do it anyway, and somehow it feels good. And of course, what do we do every year? Another arbitrary line in the sand is we think about it more personally and what it is that we want to do with our lives. How many of you, if you're willing to admit it, have made a New Year's resolution this year of some kind? Not a very strong showing. I think that was 4 of us have made New Year's resolutions. I remember asking this question, maybe this is the same context, but I remember years ago I was at a small church. When I say small, we had like 20 people, 10 people on a good Sabbath. And I remember asking that question as we went into the new year, and they were like, oh, we don't believe in New Year's resolutions. Like, what do you mean you don't believe in, you can't not believe in it. There's nothing to believe about it other than maybe you fail all the time. So maybe that's why some of us have given up on New Year's resolutions. The next question I was going to ask, but it's too small of a showing, is how many of us have already failed our New Year's resolutions at day 2? Right? Like, because we go in with such strong expectations. It's the new year, we make these plans, we draw up our life. This is what this year is going to be like. Day 1, we hit it hard, we crush it, we knock it out of the park. In fact, yesterday I went for a run. I was almost embarrassed to go for a run because I'm thinking, everyone sees me as one of them, which I am one of them because I hadn't ran for a while. But New Year's Day, you're out there running. People start showing up at the gym when gyms are open. You do all these different things, and we say, we're going to have a changed life. But then as things go on, it quickly falls apart. I was looking at the stats on this. Have you ever read this? How many people fail their New Year's resolutions? Most of us. I think it's by February, 80% of people who've made a plan, 80% have failed, have left it behind. By the time the year is over, only 8% of us have been successful. So, for those of you who have not made a New Year's resolution, I get it. You're cynical. You understand the rhythm of life that we tend to not follow through with the things that we want to follow through with. But here's the thing. Throughout life, we have these moments where we go through life and we look back and we want something to be different. That's why we make these resolutions, right? The fact that we do this again and again, it shows us that there's something inside where we're dissatisfied with something about our past. There's something about the way we lived before that we want to leave as history and do it differently going into the future. A lot of times this is about health, right? I'm not going to eat the same way. I'm going to do something different. I'm not satisfied with the late night gorges I've had before. A lot of times it's about finances. I've been spending money out of control. I'm going to live on a budget for real this time. It's going to be different. We have different things in our life that we're unsatisfied with, and that's why we resolve to live different. We look at the past, and we're not completely content with what it is, which is why I want to talk about this idea of rebooting our lives as we go into the new year. We're going to look at just a couple of different Bible characters over the next couple of weeks, and we're going to look at how different people have sort of had a reboot moment in their life. And of course, you know what this means, right? Like this idea that sometimes things become just in need of a complete reboot. Like sometimes we just want to tweak the course that we're going on. Sometimes we just need to completely redo it. And so we use this when we talk about technology. So your phone freezes up, or your computer's getting really sluggish, and so what do you have to do? You either power it off and restart it, or you go buy a Mac, because then you don't have to do it. Or Sorry, it's a cheap shot. Or like sometimes we talk about this with movies. There'll be like a series of movies, and there'll be this theme, and maybe there's even a trilogy. There's like 1, 2, 3, and they're going in order. They're all tied together, but sometimes it goes off the rails. And at some point, they say, there's still money in this project, but we can no longer keep the same storyline. We need a complete reboot. We're throwing everything away. Like I think of the Batman series. Remember this? When I was a kid, the original Batman movie comes out with Michael Keaton, and this was like this new amazing version of the comics on the big screen, and we were all excited about it. And then later, Val Kilmer took the role, and that didn't work out so great. Then George Clooney took the role, and they said, we need a complete reboot. And they brought Christian Bale, and everything was fine. And so they kept going with reboots. But here's the thing, is every once in a while, there's times in life where you need to completely scrap the old and start with something new. And I feel like this happens in our lives sometimes, that there's appropriate moments to say, maybe we need a reboot. Maybe we need to look at the way things have been going and think about it differently and let God change something about the course of our lives. And so I want to look at the story of Moses to start with today. So Moses, I'm going to start with the beginning, the Moses 1.0. This is in Exodus chapter 2, starting with verse 1. And this is the very beginning where we see Moses introduced to us. And this is like the first version that's so good. Exodus chapter 2, starting with verse 1. It says, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. And then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank as she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it, and she saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now I know this is familiar territory for most of us, and it's a kind of a big chunk, but I like looking at this whole package of the story where Moses comes into the scene. Because I feel like it's good to just sort of remind ourselves of what the circumstances were of his birth. And I have to say, you remember that the reason this is all happening is because Pharaoh is getting worried about the Hebrews. They're multiplying too quickly, and so he wants to destroy them, or at least slim them down, and so all of the Hebrew boys are supposed to be killed. This is going to be sort of a type of what's going to happen with Jesus later. But all the Hebrew boys are supposed to be killed, and so Moses' family is looking for a way to rescue him. And this has to be, in my opinion, one of the most lame rescue attempts ever, right? Like when you think about, like, you ever just think about the whole process, like just go through like this idea of their plan for Moses. Like Moses is under threat of being killed as a baby. So he's this helpless little boy, and the plan is to weave a basket and put him out in the water and just kind of shove it out there and just let him sort of be. And I don't know how this works. Like how long of a span of time do you leave him out there for? Because if you had a baby, you'd have to take care of it pretty regularly. And if you're not taking care of it pretty regularly, the thing's going to start screaming, right? And so then it's going to draw all kinds of attention, and just kind of underscoring the attention that you're drawing to the baby in the basket just floating in the river, that you have the sister standing by. This seems mildly suspicious. Like this girl just hanging out by the water, and there's a basket floating there, and it's got a baby that's probably crying at the time. And then you think about like the safety of it, right? Like we would never do this with the baby today. We have to have a life jacket if it's going to go out into the water. It doesn't seem like a safe, good plan, is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't seem like there's any kind of surety that Moses is going to get through this scenario. And the reason why I mention all of that is to say that the plan was simply pretty frail. I mean, if I was in that circumstance myself, I have no idea what could be done or what you could do to try to hide this baby. But the point is that there wasn't a good plan in place. And maybe there wasn't a better plan that could have been made. But the fact is, what we see happening here, the point of this early picture of Moses' life, is that there was something special about this child. There is something of a divine hand watching over his existence. There is providence at play. Moses was not your ordinary child born into ordinary circumstances. And it becomes all the more clear as you go through this story, because not only do they have this kind of far out plan of trying to just keep him out in the water, in the basket, but then of course, who finds him? The person that finds him is one of the worst people possible to find the baby, because it's from the very family that's trying to kill all the babies. And so if you're thinking about this as an original story, if you haven't heard this before, think of a new, this is worst case scenario. If you're watching this in film, the bad music comes on when you see the princess walking down to the river, because she's the one that's going to find the baby. And this isn't good. She shouldn't be the one that finds the baby, but she does. And instead of destroying the babies, instead of being part of the problem, she rescues the baby. And then on top of that, it's not just simply protects the baby, but places the baby in extreme privilege. And not only that, but it's the best of both worlds, where then Moses is brought up by his mother. And I feel like when I read the text and Miriam comes up to her and there's this kind of dialogue about, well, should I go find someone? I feel like the princess has to know, there has to be this understanding. She understands what's actually going on. And it's almost like this sympathetic idea of, yeah, you find a good Hebrew woman, wink, wink, who can nurse this baby, who's prepared to do that. Yeah, go find just some random person. And it seems like they all are perhaps on the same page and they know what's going on. And Moses is rescued. And not only is he rescued, but he's able to have this relationship with his family, to learn of his heritage, to be instructed about God, about worldviews, and then on top of that, be placed in a high place of power, position. We'll look at that in a little bit, but perhaps a very influential place of power where he was placed. And so as you're reading through this story, it becomes really clear. It doesn't take but these few verses for us to read to recognize this is a life headed in a certain direction. This is a life with a very clear purpose. This is a life that is exceptional. There's big plans at play. Something dramatic is going to happen through the life of Moses. Until something doesn't, right? Until years continue to go by. Because as you go through the next verses, it tells us that he grows up. And that he grows up and you start to wonder, well, how much time has passed? And it doesn't tell you how much time until you go into the New Testament and you get the story of in Acts 2 where Stephen's being stoned, and he gives us the timeline. And we find out that Moses, the next time we see him, which is going to be the next verses we'll read, where he has an interaction with the Egyptian, it's not until he's 40 years old, which I'd like to read about this because, as I mentioned, how old am I? 40. So it always feels good to find someone you can relate to. And so all of a sudden I feel like I have something going with Moses. I get where you're at, Moses. You're 40, I'm 40. I know the stage of life, the psyche that you have going on right now. And that's a long time when you think about it. When you think about this baby that was born under special circumstances, and it seemed like there was a clear path that he's going on in his life, and then suddenly you realize 40 years have passed, and nothing has really changed. It seems like Moses is clearly being set up to be a deliverer of some kind, to somehow restore justice, to stand up for the people. It looks like that's what he's being set up to do. He's being given this place, this power, this position. And yet, after 40 years, nothing has happened. And we don't know what's going on in the mind of Moses. But I want you to think about that from that perspective, the time that's gone by as we go on to the next verses. So now we're in Exodus 2 still, verse 11. It says, one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. And looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian. Then he hid him in the sand. And the next day he went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one, in the wrong. Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the other Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." And when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So there's so much to unpack in these verses, right? Like, there's so many points of Moses' story that I start to feel all these diverging roads to go down. But here's the thing I want to think about. What was really going on in the mind of Moses when he makes this decision? Here he is, 40 years old, and I imagine he has this idea that he was destined to do something for the people. And yet, for whatever reason, that opportunity has not presented itself to him. I imagine him just imagining that he's going to have some kind of sway in the dynasty there, like in the royal courts, that maybe he was going to be like the voice of reason. Or maybe he thought that he would one day take over and have the ability to call the shots himself. But after a certain point of time, nothing had really happened. And I imagine him just kind of going through life thinking like, man, what was the point of all the stuff that looked like I was the prodigy before, and all of a sudden now I just seem like another person going through life? And it starts to feel kind of relatable to me, because I feel like a lot of us at some point in our lives, we have these moments of grandeur, moments where we kind of delusionally think of ourselves as better than we actually are. Maybe it was when you were young and you're living in your parents' house and your parents are complimenting you about all the things you do, or you're taking piano lessons and you learn Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and that's amazing. You start to feel like, that is amazing. You're right, Mom and Dad. And you feel like at some point in your life, a lot of times you feel like maybe you're headed in a significant direction. I was listening to an interview of two guys on a podcast yesterday who were talking about why they journaled when they were younger. And this is like in their 20s. And they were saying, well, I journaled not for any like really good reason, other than I just had this sense that I was going to be like a significant person in history, and I wanted to document what my life looked like so that one day someone could write a great book about me. And it's like this kind of delusional thinking of, I am a significant person, and there's something that's special about my life, and I'm going to change the world. It's kind of like when you graduate from college. Remember this for some of you. You go through college and you're getting these fancy ideas placed in your head by different mentors in your life, and you get this idea that you're going to go out there and the world is going to be different because you exist. And then after a year of life post-college, you start to realize things don't change as fast as you thought they did. And then as the years tick by, sometimes you begin to question more and more your specialness, your purpose, your abilities, what it is that you're able to contribute to the world around you. And then you get to 40, and we're going to call Moses coming here to the midlife crisis period. Just out of curiosity, I Googled midlife crisis this morning to see what pops up. 40. So like I'm sitting square at that moment in life. Somewhere in that range is usually when people start having these moments. And a lot of times it comes from comparing too, right? At this age, you start to look around and you see things that have progressed in other people's lives. You see accomplishments that have progressed in their lives, and you start comparing it to your own and questioning whether you're on the right path. And sometimes you make irrational decisions. Sometimes it's buying a car that's more expensive and sportier than it should be. And sometimes, I guess in Moses' case, it's killing a man. Hopefully not that far for most of us. But Moses in this situation, I just feel like Moses is sitting here and he's feeling that frustration, that angst of a life that's passing by and not feeling like he's accomplishing what he was meant to accomplish. And so what does he do? But he takes matters into his own hands and he takes a life. Because it's so hard to live in a place of waiting. And so here's the first thing that I want to stop at, is that when we're going through life, this isn't a question about rebooting our lives. Sometimes we feel like life needs to be completely turned upside down, turned on its head, when all we really need to be doing is to be patiently waiting. There's this kind of theme that you see throughout this chapter, where it says years go by, and there's this kind of expanse of time going by, people crying out, but God hearing their calls. And it's this constant reminder in this chapter that God is still connected, God is still plugged in, but the people on the ground, they're not seeing results yet. Sometimes, though, we need to be comfortable with the wait. We need to be able to exist and wait on God's timing. The things that we want to see happen don't always happen when we want them to happen. There's a quote I want to read to you from, her name is Elizabeth Elliot. She says, "Waiting on God requires the willingness to bear uncertainty, to carry within oneself the unanswered question, lifting the heart to God about it whenever it intrudes upon one's thoughts." This idea that we have to be able to exist in the uncertainty of the situations that we live in. There are times in your life when you pray to God and He comes through. There's times in your life where you're engaged with life, you're doing something, maybe it's at work, maybe it's at home, and you see the fruit of what you're doing. You have a conversation with your kids and you see it take root and they listen to you. It's amazing. There's other times you have those conversations and nothing happens and you're thinking, what am I doing wrong? But sometimes we have to be comfortable with the uncertainty of the future and to live in those moments of waiting and expecting that God is still working even when we can't see Him working. It's part of the faith package that we talk about. The other part is that goes hand in hand with waiting is silence. There are other times in life, and times maybe the same time in life, where we don't hear what we want to hear. We don't hear that clear sense of God speaking in our lives. Again, going back to youth, I think there's so many reasons why Jesus talks about childlike faith. There's so many idealistic moments about your faith journey when you're a kid. But I feel like when I was a kid, it was more common to have these real moments that felt tangible, that felt like describable of a God-speaking moment. Like real clear kind of moments of you pray a simple prayer and you think God answered and boom, this is how God spoke. But then there's more and more times, it seems, in your adult life where it just seems like silence. You're praying for something to happen, you're wanting a kind of result, but you're not actually seeing it. And I imagine, again, for Moses, this might be part of it, is that he's praying for direction. He wants God to intervene. He wants to see his life used, and he wants to see the Israelites taken out of captivity. But nothing is actually happening. There's no result. It's just simply silence. I'm reminded of a number of years ago now. I don't remember exactly when it was, but after Mother Teresa died, a few years after that, there was the publishing of her journals. Do you remember this at all? There was this kind of shocking moment of kind of the inner life of Mother Teresa and all that she was experiencing. And it's always kind of like stood out to me. Like it's always kind of just one of those things that's almost haunting in the back of your mind because you look at this person and you think this is someone who has a very clear path that they're on and they know exactly what they're doing, what they've been called to do. And then you read her journals and it was completely different. Just a short little clip from one of them. She said this, "I call, I cling, I want, and there is no one to answer. Where I try to raise my thoughts to heaven, there is such convicting emptiness that those very thoughts return like sharp knives and hurt my very soul." And you can, of course, look at this in a couple of different ways. You can question like her actual faith journey, or you can look at this and say, man, everybody has these moments of silence. No matter what we see on the outside, no matter how put together someone looks and how clear their journey looks from my perspective, at some point, people, part of the human journey, are these moments where we pray and we don't know what the answer is. We don't know what God is doing. We don't know if God is doing. And it's hard to live in those moments of silence. It's hard to persist and not to just throw things away or to give up, to continue the journey forward. But for Moses, at some point, I feel like he's done with silence and he wants to do something. And he begins his own course. the Andrews Study Bible mentions in verse 12, when it says that he kills this man, or they strikes this man, makes the connection that this is the same word that you later see in Numbers 20 when he strikes the rock. And the Andrews Study Bible, whoever was writing the notes there, they see this connection between Moses striking the Egyptian here and that fateful day when the Israelites are wanting water from the rock. Do you remember this story? And he strikes the rock to get water out. And the words that he says is, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And there's this moment where Moses kind of gives back into his human desire to take control of the situation on his own. It's no longer about waiting on God or being comfortable with the mystery of the silence of God. It's no longer about having the faith that God's the one that's in control, but taking control of the situation himself. And he begins this idea that he's going to strike this man down, and that something's going to happen from this, that something good is going to happen. In fact, when in Acts, when Stephen is quoting about this story and kind of outlining this story, he gives the idea that Moses thought that everyone would kind of like stand in awe. Like, it doesn't say those words exactly, but thought that people would just recognize the deliverer had come, and that there would be this swell. Like, he thought this was going to be the breaking point, kind of the dam bursting, and that things would change from this point. But of course, sometimes the way that we see ourselves acting isn't the way that other people see us. And so one of the things that we recognize is that especially when we are giving into our own ambitions, when we're using our own strength, relying on our own resources, it's not necessarily going to have the captivating effect that we think it will have, and there will be outsiders who will not see the intention that we have. And of course, the situation here with the Hebrew is after this, post this day, the next thing that we see happening with Moses is that he's trying to weigh into another situation, bring justice to another situation. But they doubt his sincerity. Are you going to kill me the way that you killed this other Egyptian? And by the way, when I was reading different commentaries on this, there was this one commentary that was saying, well, we don't really know the circumstances. This could have been self-defense with Moses. Like Moses was just sort of like in this moment, and he tried to intervene, and the Egyptian hit back, and then he, just defended himself, and that's how the Egyptian died. But I don't think that's how the text reads. Like, it says that he looks this way and that way to make sure that nobody's watching before he goes into the situation and then buries the man. It really seems like Moses messed up in a significant way. It seems like Moses really hit the bottom of the barrel at this moment. And so when we're talking about the idea for a need of a reboot in our lives, like a starting over period, to me, I see this moment right here with Moses as that moment for him. Because right here, he was already starting to feel perhaps a bit desperate about the amount of time that has passed on in his life. He's 40 years old. But suddenly this brings everything to the situation where it doesn't look like things are going anywhere good. Suddenly, if we want to talk about waiting, here is a new period of waiting that he starts. He leaves the position of influence. He leaves the place where it looks like he actually has the ability to make a difference. And now he's going out to a desert life, living like as a shepherd. Another 40 years are going to go by in this situation before anything happens, before there's any developments, that he's living out his life calling. So here's step one. If we want to have a reboot in our lives, if we want to see God do something in us, through us, and use us the way that he designed us to be used, we have to be comfortable again with this idea of waiting on it. We can't be impatient for it. It's not about your timing. It's not about my timing. We have to be comfortable with the idea that it will happen when it happens, that God will use you and your talents, your abilities, and your passions in the way that he sees fit. So with that, I want to actually go to Hebrews, because I feel like Hebrews gives us kind of a succinct little grasp of the story of Moses. And I want to look at this for ideas of how we could be rebooted in our lives as well. Because obviously Moses eventually gets to the point where things start over, right? He comes back, he's used in a powerful way, one of the biggest figures in the Old Testament, brings the Israelites out of slavery. The reboot happens. There is a second act to his story. But I feel like there's some ideas about how we can live our lives that we get out from the book of Hebrews. So Hebrews chapter 11, I'm going to start with verse 24. It says this, it says, "It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of God than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eye on the one who is invisible." First thing that we see here is that Moses had clarity about his identity. The clarity in his identity is he recognized that he could have been Pharaoh's daughter, or he could have been Pharaoh's daughter's son, right? Like this could have been part of the royal lineup, but he recognized that's not who he was. And this is a significant sacrifice when you think about it. We don't know for sure, but I was reading this is from the Matthew Henry commentary. According to the tradition of the Jews, it's that Pharaoh's daughter had no child of her own, and that she was the only child of her father, which would then mean that he was adopted as her son to be next in line as king. This idea was that, according to Jewish tradition, that Moses wasn't just another one of the kids in the royal court, but that he was the only son available to inherit the throne at this moment. And so when he recognizes that he's not Pharaoh's daughter's son, and he sees himself as someone different, he sees his lineage being tied to the Jews, it's a clear sense of identity that cost him something. The easy way is to simply say, this is who I am, part of this court. But no, he's saying, I identify with someone else. And I think part of his identity is also recognizing what he has been called to do, because it's a theme that we see throughout his life. And that is that he has something that burns inside his heart. He has a heart for justice. He wants to see things rectified. And so we see it in this situation, as poorly played out as it was. We see it in the situation where he kills the Egyptian, standing up for someone. We see it when he intervenes with two Hebrews who are arguing. We see it when he comes back. Oh, we see it before that. We see it when he goes out when he flees and he comes across Jethro's daughters. So he stands up for the Midianites, right? We see it in all these moments in his life that he has something inside him that burns for justice. You see, here's the thing that's interesting to me when we talk about rebooting our lives. I feel like most of us, a lot of us, we have these different desires. We have passions. We have things that we've had from a very young age. When you think about when you were a young child, when you think about when you were a teenager, if you're not a teenager now, when you think about your young adulthood years, what are some of the common threads that you've had? What are some of the things that connect the dots in your life that continue to play out? What are the things that you have had a passion for? What are the things that you've had an interest in? What are the causes that you've wanted to stand up for? Because I believe that God does create these things in us. God gives us these desires. He gives us these things that he wants us to live out. This is kind of the Ephesians 2:10, that we were created to live out these purposes from time old. This idea that God wants to do good works through your life. And while the scenarios change in our life, and while there's moments of like where it doesn't look like things are working out, it feels like our lives need to be rebooted, we need to go back to those original callings that we have. What are the original callings God has placed on your heart? And so you see with the story of Moses, even when he's not living out faithfully, when he's relying on his own strength, he still has the same passion carrying through. And he doesn't abandon that in the reboot of his life. He leans into that and continues to find God leading him into fighting injustices, into being the judge, into being the ruler, being the one to call the people out. The next thing is that I would hit on as a connection is that if we want a true reboot, if we want to see our life purpose lived out well, we can't be afraid of sacrifice. It says that he chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. This idea that he was living in a place of privilege, but he chose to do something different. He chose sacrifice in his life. If we really want to see our lives make an impact, we can't be afraid of doing the hard things. We can't be afraid of giving up things that we may even cherish, that we hold tight to. We can't be afraid of pain. I feel like this goes counter-culture to the Western world that we live in. Right? Like every time that we have some kind of pain, we want to take care of it immediately. We want to have some kind of pain medication. Like the second I feel something happening, right? Maybe we can relate on this, but I remember when I broke my wrist this spring, I was so frustrated they weren't giving me anything right away. My wrist hurt. I remember the drive to the clinic wasn't really bumpy, but it felt like it was really bumpy. And I was thinking, like, the second I get there, I bet they're gonna hit me with a needle and everything's gonna be better. But then they didn't, and I was so mad. Just take away the pain. We don't like to exist in pain. We want quick fixes for the things that are uncomfortable. But maybe the things that are uncomfortable are the things that we have to press up against sometimes, or the things that actually grow us and equip us to be the right kind of people. You ever watch the movie WALL-E? Great lessons in the movie WALL-E. Anyone see this? I feel like I see 3. Okay, good. We've got a couple with us. That striking moment to me in the movie WALL-E is when you finally come across the humans. What are their condition? Like they're living in a life of comfort, but it's handicapping them in the process. Like they have to wheel around in these little scooter things. It's been a long time since I've seen it. I don't remember exactly, but they're living a life of comfort where technology takes care of everything for them. They're living a life free of pain and resistance, but the impact on their lives is actually a very negative one. It's not making them better people. They can barely get around on their own without any kind of help. We need to not be afraid of pain, sacrifice, and resistance. If we want to see God do something in our lives, if we want to see God do something new with this year as we go forward into 2021, if we want a reboot of our lives, we can't shy away from the sacrifice. And then the final thing is risk. We have to be willing to take risks in our lives and actually move forward and do things. Hebrews takes the text that I read in Exodus and flips it on its head. Because when I read the story of Moses, and he kills this Egyptian in that moment, he flees, I see the act of a coward. I see someone who's leaving the scene for fear of what Pharaoh is going to do for him, which is pretty much exactly what Exodus says, right? But Hebrews goes back to the story, and it reinterprets the moment. This is again from Hebrews, I think I'm at verse 26 now. Or no, it's verse 27. It says, "It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eye on the one who is invisible." He left the land of Egypt. He made a decision. He made an action in response to previous actions, but he makes a decision in this moment by faith, keeping his eye on the thing that's invisible in his life. The question is, for us, what does that look like to live out your faith like that? Are there ways that you found yourself over time becoming more paralyzed in your faith journey with God? Maybe you've been hurt. Maybe you, like Moses, have made mistakes in the past, things that you kind of have skeletons in your closet, things that you're not really sure you want to own up to. Maybe you've had disappointments, setbacks, moments where it just feels like God isn't working the way that it felt like God was promising to work in your life earlier, and now you're not sure what to do. Sometimes the easy thing for us to do is to draw inward, to live less, to close off the avenues to our life more and more, and try to be safer in our approach to living. Take less risk, expose ourselves less, less of the putting our heart out there, because if you put your heart out there, it might get hurt in a way that you weren't expecting it to. But if we want to see change, if we want to see a reversal of the way that life has been going, if it hasn't been going that great, the question is, how can we lean into this more? How can we be people who are willing to take an action by faith and recognize that there might be disappointment, there might be silence, there might be waiting, but we live by faith for the thing that's invisible? How many of us are willing to take a sacrifice in our lives? What I want you to imagine is I want you to imagine what it would look like to live like that differently. On a personal level, what would it look like this year as you go into this new year to live with more risk, to lean back into the faith of your youth? What would it look like to not be afraid of the pain that might come along? What does it look like as a church community, as a church body, to think about what our identity is, what our callings have been? What does it look like to think about this vision that was gifted to us? I'm thinking like Pastor Keel, who's sitting right here, this idea that we've lived with for so long, that we're here to disciple young people, to capture their hearts and minds, developing them into fully devoted disciples of Christ. And like you look back at the last year and you think, man, this is such a setback year. We couldn't live out that kind of vision the way that we could before. But what does it look like to take risks and to rethink the values that we've had from the beginning, to live them afresh today, whether it's personally, whether it's corporately? How do we do that? Let's pray. Father God, I just want to give our hearts over to you right now. I just want to ask that you will take the mistakes, the brokenness, the setbacks, the disappointments from our past. Help us to lean back into you and reinvest our lives into your arms. I pray that you will continue to grow us and build us